She was born on a rainy night in Louisiana, the kind of night where thunder feels close enough to touch, and the sky seems angry at the earth. The nurse wrapped her in a thin white cloth, looked down once and paused, just for a second too long. That pause would become the story of her entire life. Her skin was darker than everyone else's in the room. Not just dark, unforgivably dark, as some would later call it. Her mother kissed her forehead anyway. Her father held her once, briefly, then handed her back, as if the weight of her color was heavier than the weight of the child herself. No one said anything out loud that night, but silence has a language of its own, and the baby girl learned it early. They named her Evelyn. As she grew, the world began to explain, without mercy, what her color meant. In school, she noticed it first in mirrors and second in people. Other children were chosen for plays, for pictures, for praise. Evelyn was chosen for chores. When the teacher divided the class into angels and stars for the Christmas show, Evelyn was placed behind the curtain to help hold props. She didn't complain, she never did. She learned early that complaining did not change skin. At home, things were quieter, but more painful. Her sisters were lighter, not white, not even close, but lighter enough. Lighter enough to be called pretty. Lighter enough to be posted proudly in photo frames. Lighter enough to be introduced to guests with smiles. Evelyn was introduced with instructions. Take her to the back. She helps in the kitchen. She doesn't like crowds. That last one was a lie. Evelyn loved people. She loved voices, laughter, stories. But people did not love looking at her. Years passed. Life moved on. Evelyn married young, not because she was loved deeply, but because someone finally agreed to take her. Her husband was kind at first, then quiet, then gone. He left behind children and questions, and a woman who already knew how to survive being unwanted. She raised her kids with everything she had: food when there wasn't enough, warmth when the heater broke, love even when love had never been shown to her properly. And when her children grew up, she prayed only one prayer, always the same: please let their lives be easier than mine. Time did what it always does. It bent her back, silvered her hair, wrinkled her hands, and one day she became Grandma Evelyn. That was supposed to be her reward. But America had not changed as much as it pretended to. And families, especially families, carry the oldest prejudices the longest. Her grandchildren loved her voice, but not her face. They loved her stories, but not her presence. They loved her cooking, but only when she stayed in the kitchen. At family gatherings, she noticed the pattern before anyone else did. Seats filled up, photos were taken, laughter rose, and somehow every time, Evelyn was standing just outside the frame. Grandma, stand here, they would say, pointing somewhere behind. Behind the couch, behind the door, behind everyone else. When neighbors came over, she was asked to rest in her room. When friends visited, she was told she looked tired. When birthdays were celebrated, her name was forgotten first. No one said, "It's because you're dark." They didn't have to. She saw how the lighter grandmother on the other side of the family was treated, how she was hugged in public, how her pictures were shared online with captions full of hearts, how her wrinkles were called beautiful. Evelyn's wrinkles were called old. At night, alone in her small room, she would sit by the window and wash her hands slowly, watching the dark skin move under the water. Once, just once, she whispered a question she had carried her whole life: God, if you had made me lighter, would they have loved me more? There was no answer, just the sound of traffic and the ticking of a clock that seemed impatient with her existence. Still, she loved them all. She loved the grandchildren who flinched when friends asked, "Is she really your grandma?" She loved the daughters-in-law who corrected children when they called her too black. She loved the sons who stayed silent because silence was easier than defense. Her love did not depend on how she was treated, but her pain grew anyway. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, ironically gold, she sat alone at the dinner table. Plates were cleared, conversations moved to other rooms, and for the first time in decades, something inside her shifted. Not anger, not bitterness, something heavier: realization. She realized that being born with dark skin had not just shaped how strangers treated her, it had decided how her own family valued her. And that realization hurt more than any insult ever could. She folded her napkin carefully. She always folded things carefully. People who feel invisible learn to leave no mess behind. As she stood up, her reflection caught her eye in the glass cabinet. An old black woman stared back, tired eyes, strong spine, a lifetime written in shadows. She did not hate that woman. She just wondered why everyone else did. And somewhere deep inside Grandma Evelyn, far beneath the silence, beneath the patience, beneath the unconditional love, a story was forming, a story the family would only understand when it was already too late. The house looked warm from the outside. White walls, a clean porch, wind chimes singing softly whenever the evening breeze passed through. Neighbors often said, "Such a loving home." And maybe it was, for everyone except the woman who had helped build it with her broken hands. Inside, love followed rules, and color decided where those rules applied. Grandma Evelyn lived in the smallest room, not because she asked for it, but because it was practical. That was the word they used when they didn't want to say unimportant. Her room held a narrow bed, a dresser missing one handle, and a small Bible with pages worn thin from decades of silent prayers. In the living room, family photos covered the walls. Smiling faces, bright skin, matching outfits, holidays frozen in perfect frames. If someone studied those pictures closely, they might notice something strange. Evelyn appeared rarely, and when she did, she was always on the edge. Never centered, never highlighted, never celebrated. She noticed it the day her youngest grandson asked a question that no adult had the courage to ask out loud. "Grandma," he said, holding a framed photo, "why do you look darker than everyone else?" The room went quiet, too quiet. His mother laughed nervously. "Kids say silly things," she said, quickly taking the frame from his hands. "Go play." Evelyn smiled. She always smiled. The kind of smile that protects everyone else, while slowly destroying the person wearing it. "It's just the light, baby," she said gently. But it wasn't the light. At dinner, the rules were unspoken but clear. Evelyn served first and ate last. Conversations flowed around her, not toward her. When she spoke, people nodded politely, like you do with someone whose story you've already decided doesn't matter. When guests visited, the house changed. "Mom, why don't you rest in your room?" "Mom, your knees must be hurting." "Mom, we'll call you when dessert is ready." Dessert almost never came. She heard laughter through the walls, heard stories being told, some of them her stories, retold without her name. She sat on her bed, hands folded, listening to a family, enjoying the comfort she had paid for with her dignity. Sometimes she wondered what hurt more, being openly hated, or being quietly erased. Her daughters treated her differently too. The lighter one hugged her in public, but corrected her in private. The darker one loved her deeply, but had learned early that loving her openly came with consequences. "Don't say anything, Mama," her daughter once whispered. "They don't mean it." Evelyn nodded. She had heard that sentence her whole life. "They don't mean it. They're just joking. You're too sensitive." That's just how things are. America loved pretending pain was imaginary if it made people uncomfortable. At church, it was the same story dressed in Sunday clothes. The pastor spoke of equality. The choir sang about love, but even there, Evelyn sat near the back, where no one accidentally mistook her for someone important. One Sunday, a woman leaned over and whispered, "You're so strong, I don't know how you people do it." "You people." Evelyn smiled again. Strength, she had learned, was the word people used when they didn't want to offer kindness. At night, she replayed her life in fragments, moments she had buried deep so she could survive. The job interviews that ended the moment she walked in. The compliments that always came with surprise. The way people praised her children for being not as dark. She had carried those memories quietly, like fragile glass, careful not to let them shatter her. But something was changing. It started small, a heaviness in her chest when she laughed, a tiredness that sleep didn't fix, a feeling not of sadness, but of being done. Done explaining, done shrinking, done pretending not to notice. One evening, she overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. "I just wish she didn't look so," a voice said, trailing off. "So what?" another asked. "So, you know." They laughed softly. Evelyn stood in the hallway, unseen, holding a folded blanket to her chest. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of a truth finally spoken aloud. In that moment, something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let the pain breathe. She returned to her room and sat on the bed. For the first time in years, she didn't open her Bible. Instead, she opened a small notebook she had hidden at the bottom of her drawer. Blank pages. Waiting. She picked up a pen. If love in this house had a shade, she thought, then maybe truth did too. And she was finally ready to let it be seen. It started with small excuses. "Grandma, maybe you should stay home today." "Grandma, it's really crowded." "Grandma, you won't enjoy it anyway." Evelyn learned to recognize the pattern. Whenever there were cameras, strangers, or places where appearances mattered, she suddenly didn't belong. The first time it truly hit her was at her granddaughter's school event. She had ironed her dress carefully, chosen her best shoes, even though they hurt. She wanted to look nice, not to impress anyone, but to honor the moment. A grandmother should be there when a child stands on stage for the first time. As they arrived, parents filled the auditorium. Phones came out, smiles widened. Evelyn followed a few steps behind her family, as she always did. Then it happened. Her daughter stopped suddenly and turned around. "Mom, maybe you should sit near the back." Evelyn nodded. That word "back" had followed her all her life. From the back row, she watched her granddaughter perform. She clapped softly, tears forming in her eyes, not just from pride, but from something heavier. Around her, grandparents leaned forward, proudly calling out names. No one called hers. After the show, photos were taken outside. "Let's get one just with the kids," someone said quickly. "Oh, and one with grandparents," another added, already positioning everyone. Evelyn stepped forward. The camera shifted slightly, just enough to push her toward the edge. Her granddaughter glanced at her, hesitated, then looked away. That look broke something. Not because the child was cruel, but because the child had learned. At the mall, it was worse. She noticed how her family walked faster when she was beside them, how conversations stopped when strangers passed, how hands gently, but firmly guided her a step behind. Once, a woman smiled at her grandson and said, "Your grandma is so sweet." He corrected her without thinking. "That's not my grandma, that's my dad's mom." Evelyn pretended not to hear, but the words followed her all the way home. She began to remove herself before anyone could ask. She stayed behind when they went out, sat quietly when guests arrived, learned the art of becoming invisible. Invisibility, she discovered, was less painful than rejection, most days. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media on her old phone, she saw photos from a family barbecue she had cooked for, but hadn't attended. Smiling faces, group hugs, sunlight, and laughter. No Evelyn. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. She remembered every dish she had prepared that day. The hours on her feet, the careful seasoning, the way she had wiped sweat from her face and smiled anyway. And yet she was absent, erased, as if she had never been there at all. That night, she asked a question she had avoided for years. "Am I an embarrassment to you?" The room froze. Her son looked at the floor. Her daughter sighed. Someone said, "Mom, don't start." That was the answer. No denial. No reassurance. Just discomfort. She returned to her room, closed the door, and finally let herself cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet sobs of someone who has carried pain too long. She cried for the little girl, who had learned early that color mattered. She cried for the woman who gave everything and received silence. She cried for the grandmother who loved fiercely and was loved conditionally. In the mirror, she studied her face. The deep lines, the dark skin, the eyes that had seen too much. "I didn't choose this," she whispered, but the world had chosen for her. The next morning, something was different. She woke up calm, too calm. She began putting things in order, folding clothes, organizing papers, labeling old photos with names no one ever asked about. And in her notebook, the pages were no longer blank. Words filled them now, honest words, painful words, true words. She wasn't planning revenge. She wasn't planning confrontation. She was planning truth. Because if they didn't want to be seen with her in life, they would have no choice but to see her, in her absence. And that thought, terrifying and empowering, stayed with her as she closed the notebook and locked it away. Silence is often mistaken for peace. In Evelyn's house, silence was punishment. No one argued with her, no one shouted, no one said cruel words to her face. And yet, every day, she felt smaller, like a shadow slowly fading under bright lights that were never meant for her. Mornings were the hardest. She would wake before everyone else, as she always had, and move quietly through the kitchen. The floor remembered her footsteps better than the people did. She brewed coffee she rarely drank, cooked breakfast she no longer shared, packed lunches for hands that barely touched hers. "Morning, Mom," someone would say, already looking at their phone. "Morning," she'd reply, already invisible. No one noticed when she stopped talking as much. No one asked why her laughter disappeared. Silence made her convenient. Silence made others comfortable. Once, at the breakfast table, she tried. "I was thinking," she began softly, "maybe next Sunday we could all." "We're busy next Sunday," her son interrupted without looking up. The conversation moved on. Her sentence stayed unfinished in the air, hanging there like a question no one wanted answered. At church, people praised her quiet nature. She's so humble. She keeps to herself. She's such a strong woman. Strong, quiet, invisible. They mistook her silence for acceptance. They never wondered if it was survival. Days blended into each other. Evelyn stopped marking time by events and started marking it by absences. The day no one asked her opinion. The day no one noticed she wasn't at the table. The day her birthday passed with a casual "oh, was that today?" She smiled anyway. That smile had become a habit, a reflex, a shield. But inside, words piled up. Words she never said. Questions she never asked. Truths she never shared. They grew heavy. One evening, while the family watched television together, a news segment played about racism, about how America was changing, about how people were learning. Someone scoffed, "People are too sensitive these days." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. She wanted to speak, to tell them that racism wasn't always loud, that sometimes it lived in living rooms, in photo frames, in who was invited and who wasn't. Her lips parted, then she closed them again. Silence won. Later that night, she sat on her bed, notebook open, pen trembling in her hand. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if they had been waiting decades for permission. I learned early that my color made people uncomfortable. I learned that love could be conditional. I learned that silence keeps the peace, but steals the soul. She paused, tears blurring the ink. No one had ever asked her how it felt, so she wrote it anyway. She wrote about the first time she realized she was treated differently, about the looks, the jokes, the pauses, the way people's faces changed when she entered a room. She wrote about her family, not with anger, but with heartbreaking honesty, about how love was given carefully, about how she was tolerated, not cherished. And as she wrote, something unexpected happened. She felt lighter, not because the pain disappeared, but because it was no longer trapped inside her. In the following days, her silence changed shape. It was no longer empty, it was intentional. She listened more, observed more, noted every small dismissal, every subtle exclusion. Every time someone spoke around her instead of to her, she realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. They didn't hear her because they had never truly seen her. And they never would, unless something forced them to. One afternoon, her youngest grandchild wandered into her room. He sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her with wide, curious eyes. "Grandma," he asked, "are you sad?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then she smiled softly. "Why do you ask? You're always quiet now." For a moment, for just a moment, she considered telling the truth. The real truth, the kind that breaks cycles. But she saw how young he was, how unprepared. "Grandma's just tired," she said instead. He nodded and hugged her quickly before running off. That hug stayed with her all day. That night, she added another line to her notebook. "One day, my silence will speak louder than I ever could." She closed the notebook, placed it carefully back in the drawer, and turned off the light. In the darkness, Evelyn made a quiet decision. If her voice had been ignored her whole life, then her absence would be impossible to ignore. Children often speak the truth before the world teaches them to hide it. Evelyn had always known this, but even so, nothing could prepare her for the words that slipped out of her youngest grandson's mouth one Sunday afternoon. The family had gathered for brunch at her house, a rare moment when everyone was present. Plates clinked, voices rose and fell, laughter floated in the air, and sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting golden patterns on the polished floor. Evelyn stood by the kitchen counter, watching, smiling silently, as she always did. Her grandson, little Michael, no more than 7, was drawing at the table, his crayons scattered around him. He glanced up at her, tilted his head, and asked in a voice so innocent, it seemed to hang in the air like a prayer, "Grandma, why is your skin so dark?" The room froze. Forks paused midair, conversations halted, eyes darted to Evelyn, then away. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but with a lifetime of recognition. Every whispered insult, every careful exclusion, every look that told her she didn't belong. All of it compressed into that one question. Before anyone could respond, she knelt to his level and smiled softly. "Because, my love," she said gently, "that's the way God made me. And God made you too, in your own special way." Michael's curiosity didn't fade. "But why do other people look different?" "Everyone is different, honey," she replied, "some lighter, some darker. That's what makes the world colorful." Her words were soft, but the silence that followed them was deafening. The adults at the table avoided her eyes. They shifted uncomfortably, murmured excuses, and moved the conversation elsewhere. Her daughter whispered harshly under her breath, Don't encourage questions like that. But Evelyn knew she had no choice. She had to speak, even if only to a child. Later, when the family left, Evelyn sat alone in her kitchen, the question echoing in her mind, why am I not like the rest? It wasn't a new question. She had asked it silently countless times over her life. But hearing it from a child, innocent, unfiltered, struck deeper than any insult ever could. She thought of every family gathering she had attended, every photograph where she stood just behind someone else, every event she had been quietly excluded from, every compliment that came with surprise and condescension. And now it had been verbalized in the purest, most honest form imaginable. Evelyn didn't feel anger toward the child. No, he hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply asked what he saw. And what he saw was the truth. She was different, and the world had treated her differently because of it. She poured herself a cup of tea and held it carefully in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her palms. That day, a realization came over her, a quiet but powerful certainty. She could no longer allow herself to remain invisible. The child's question had unlocked something in her, something she had kept buried under decades of politeness, silence, and endurance. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about recognition. The world had ignored her for too long. Her love had been taken for granted. Her presence had been erased. And now it was time to write. Her notebook, tucked safely in the drawer, suddenly seemed too small to hold the weight of what she needed to say. She opened it, pen trembling in her hand, and wrote, "They will notice me, eventually." She wrote about every slight, every exclusion, every unspoken rule that had dictated her life, every meal served but never shared, every story told but never attributed to her, every smile she had given freely, met with indifference. The ink spilled out like a river, pouring decades of silence onto the page. That night, Evelyn slept with a heavy heart, but a determined mind. She knew that innocence, the kind only a child could possess, had given her a gift. It had reminded her of her worth. It had reminded her that even if the world didn't see her value, she could still claim it for herself. Tomorrow, she thought as she closed her eyes, the writing would continue. The telling of the story, the full story, had only just begun. Family photos were supposed to capture memories, love and belonging. For Evelyn, they had always done the exact opposite. The living room walls were lined with pictures from every milestone she had silently helped create. Weddings, birthdays, graduations, holidays all frozen in time. But in every single photograph, she noticed the same pattern. Her face was almost always at the edge, cropped or obscured. Sometimes she was missing entirely, replaced in the frame by lighter relatives smiling proudly. It wasn't an accident. One Sunday afternoon, Evelyn's son brought out the family album, dusting it off with a sense of pride. He had invited neighbors over to look at the pictures. Her heart sank as he flipped page after page. "There's Aunt May in this one, so beautiful," he said, pointing to a picture of her sister-in-law. "She really shines," said another family member. Evelyn's hand rested on the counter, trembling slightly, but no one noticed. Then he reached the page from last year's Christmas. "Where's Grandma?" a neighbor asked innocently. Her son froze. His fingers hovered over the page as he turned it carefully. "She wasn't in this one," he mumbled. Evelyn forced a smile, her throat tight. "I wasn't invited," she said quietly. No one responded. She remembered helping with the decorations, cooking the food, wrapping the presents, but none of that mattered in the photos. Photos didn't show invisible work. Photos didn't acknowledge effort unless it fit the family's idea of who deserved recognition. Evelyn began to notice how photographs had silently dictated her place in the family. Each frame was a story of omission. The cousins who smiled in perfect alignment, the daughters-in-law in sparkling dresses, the grandchildren in festive hats, and her, always behind, always at the edge, often cropped out entirely. Sometimes she would stare at a photo for hours, tracing the familiar curve of a table, the outline of a chair, the empty space where her face should have been. It wasn't just exclusion, it was erasure. One night, alone in her room, she pulled out an old photo she had secretly kept. A black and white picture of her as a young woman, holding a tray of food for a family gathering. Her smile was wide, genuine, and full of hope. Yet in the modern albums, that same smile was gone, replaced by silence, by absence. Her hand shook as she held the photo. The injustice of a lifetime pressed down on her chest. She realized the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. It wasn't just strangers who had rejected her, not just society. Her own family had learned the habit of erasure, passing it down like a silent inheritance. She thought about her grandchildren, who had no memory of a grandmother's love that was unconditionally given, yet invisibly maintained. They would only see the curated, sanitized version of the family where she didn't belong. That night, she sat at her small desk and wrote fiercely in her notebook. I was here, I loved, I gave everything, and I will not be forgot. Her pen scratched across the page like thunder in a silent sky. Every omitted face in every photograph became a testament to her endurance, her resilience, and her unseen suffering. Evelyn understood something in that moment. Truth would be louder than pictures. Her story, once written, would demand to be seen. And if her life had been erased from the frames, her words would ensure she could never be ignored again. Evelyn had always avoided mirrors as much as possible, but there was a time when she still looked, briefly, cautiously, at her reflection, searching for validation she knew she would never receive. The day she stopped completely, however, was quiet, unremarkable to the world, devastating to her soul. It began with the bathroom mirror in her home. She approached it, as she had hundreds of times before, brushing her gray-streaked hair and straightening the worn collar of her blouse. She wanted nothing more than a glance, to see herself as she had once been, a woman full of life, color, and hope. Instead, she saw someone invisible. The reflection staring back was familiar, yet alien, dark skin-lined face, tired eyes, the eyes that had witnessed decades of exclusion, neglect, and quiet cruelty. The face that had been pushed to the margins in every photo, every gathering, every memory that mattered to others. She touched her face, tracing the lines that told stories of love given but ignored, sacrifices unnoticed, and labor that went unrecognized. Tears welled in her eyes, not the loud, dramatic kind, but slow, persistent, soaking into the skin like rain on dry earth. Why had she looked for validation in a world that refused to give it? She wondered. Evelyn thought of the children who flinched when strangers asked about her, the family members who laughed at jokes made about her skin, the daughters-in-law who corrected grandchildren when they called her too dark, the husband who left quietly, the community that tolerated her only when she was convenient. Mirror after mirror, photograph after photograph. The world had told her, you do not matter, and she believed it, just enough to keep living. But that morning, standing in front of the mirror, she felt something shift. She lowered her gaze, turned away, and decided she would no longer measure herself by the world's reflection. She would no longer look for approval in eyes that had never truly seen her. From that day on, Evelyn avoided mirrors entirely, not out of shame, but out of defiance. She began to walk through the house with her head held high, even if others failed to look at her. She cooked, cleaned, loved, and gave advice quietly, but without seeking acknowledgement. She learned that her worth was not in the reflection of others' eyes. Still, her heart carried the weight of what had been stolen. She could not forget the years of subtle erasure, the invitations she never received, the chairs pulled away from her at family gatherings, the photos cropped to hide her presence, the laughter that always skipped over her. And so she wrote. Her notebook became her new mirror. Every page reflected her life honestly, painfully, beautifully. Every word was a reclamation of identity, a refusal to remain invisible any longer. I am here, she wrote in bold, deliberate strokes. I existed, I mattered, and they will see it. For the first time in decades, Evelyn felt a quiet, unshakable strength. The mirrors could no longer define her. The world's gaze could no longer diminish her. Her voice, through her words, through her story, would be the reflection that mattered. And in the solitude of her room, she realized something profound. She no longer needed anyone's permission to exist fully. Festivals were always loud, colorful, and full of laughter. For most families, they were a time of celebration, togetherness, and joy. For Evelyn, they had always been a reminder of what she wasn't allowed to fully share. It was Christmas this time. The house buzzed with excitement, lights twinkled, children ran through the hallways, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon wafted through the rooms. Her daughters-in-law were busy decorating the living room, adjusting ornaments, and taking selfies for social media. The grandchildren squealed with delight as they pulled out gifts carefully hidden under the tree. Evelyn had spent hours in the kitchen preparing everything: cookies, pies, side dishes, and her famous sweet potato casserole. She had cleaned, scrubbed, and arranged the dining table with precision. She had done all of it without complaint because this was her love, quiet, selfless, and unacknowledged. And then came the invitations, or the lack thereof. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to be out there," her son said, pointing toward the living room filled with laughing guests. "You've done enough in the kitchen." Evelyn paused, her hands froze mid-motion, holding a platter of freshly baked cookies. She looked at the room, so bright, so alive, so full of people, and realized she wasn't actually invited to join the celebration. She had prepared it all, yes, but she wasn't welcome in the moments she had created. She had been invisible before, but this was different. She carried the food to the dining room, placing it carefully on the table. Guests smiled politely as they helped themselves. She stood to the side, her back straight, a smile fixed on her face, and watched as everyone celebrated the joy she had baked into every dish. Her granddaughter ran by and tugged at her sleeve. "Grandma, come play with us." Evelyn's chest tightened. She knelt down, brushing her hands over the child's hair. "I can watch from here, honey," she said softly. "You have so much fun." And then the realization hit her like a wave. The festival, the joy, the laughter, all of it was theirs to enjoy, not hers. The children didn't understand. They hadn't learned the cruelty of exclusion yet. But the adults around her, they had perfected it over decades. Every glance, every unspoken instruction, every polite "stay back" was part of a pattern she had lived with her entire life. She retreated quietly to the kitchen. The warmth of the oven seemed comforting, though the tears in her eyes betrayed her calm exterior. She let herself cry softly, while the sounds of joy filled the house. Not for herself alone, but for the generations of Black women like her, who had been made to stand on the margins, to labor without acknowledgement, and to love without reciprocation. That night, when the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table, notebook in hand. She wrote, "I baked the joy they enjoyed. I decorated the tree they adored. I carried the weight of love they took for granted. And still, I am always standing outside." She closed the notebook, her hands trembling, and realized that this pain, this exclusion, had become a fuel to reclaim her story, a fuel to tell the truth that had been silenced for decades. Evelyn understood something profound that evening. The festival wasn't just a celebration of holidays, it was a celebration of selective visibility, a cruel reminder of who was allowed to shine, and she would no longer accept being invisible. Evelyn's love had always been quiet but relentless. It didn't demand attention, it didn't ask for praise, and it certainly didn't require acknowledgement. She had learned early that love could be unconditional, even when the world refused to see her worth. Her grandchildren, those same children who flinched when strangers questioned their family, loved her stories. Her cooking, her gentle hands on scraped knees, her soft lullabies at bedtime. Yet paradoxically, they sometimes treated her with distance. It wasn't hate, it was inherited prejudice. Subtle and insidious, the kind that doesn't need words to wound. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn noticed her eldest granddaughter struggling with a school project. Tears streaked her face, and frustration had turned her small shoulders rigid. Evelyn knelt beside her, careful not to touch the broken pride that clung to the girl. "Grandma, I just can't do it," the child whispered. Evelyn smiled softly, brushing damp hair from her granddaughter's face. "You can, honey. We just need to try a different way." Hours passed. Pages were filled with diagrams, equations, and colorful markers. Evelyn guided without taking credit, corrected without raising her voice, and encouraged without expectation. By the end, the child beamed, proud of her own accomplishment. "Thank you, Grandma," she said, hugging Evelyn tightly. No one saw this moment, no one applauded, photographed, or praised Evelyn for it. But it didn't matter. She understood that love wasn't a currency to be measured, it was a gift freely given, and freely received in the hearts that needed it most. Even when her family overlooked her at meals, events, and photos, Evelyn's heart remained vast. She remembered her own childhood, excluded, unseen, silenced, and she vowed that her grandchildren would not carry that weight of shame for her. She cooked meals she knew would be eaten and appreciated by the children, not by the adults who sneered quietly behind polite smiles. She sewed costumes for school, plays the kids would never mention to others. She stayed awake when little ones were sick, rocking them back to sleep, even when no one acknowledged her sacrifice. Evelyn loved like the sun rises, without asking for notice, without demanding attention, without expectation of reciprocity. And in this quiet, unwavering love, she discovered her own strength. She realized that though the world may erase her from photos, conversations, and celebrations, her love was indelible. It had the power to outlast prejudice, ignorance, and the silence of those who chose not to see her. That evening, she sat by the window, looking at the street where the children had played earlier. She wrote in her notebook, "I may not be noticed by all, but I am essential to those who feel love's true weight. Their joy is mine, their triumphs mine, and that is enough. For Evelyn, unconditional love wasn't just an act, it was a rebellion. A rebellion against invisibility, prejudice, and neglect. And it was a rebellion she carried proudly, silently, every day of her life. Even when the world forgot she existed, Evelyn knew that the heart she poured into her family could never be erased. Evelyn had a secret she had carried quietly for decades, tucked away in the corners of her mind where no one dared to look. It wasn't scandalous, not in the sense that people might gossip about, but to her, it was heavier than any burden she had ever endured. It began long before she became Grandma Evelyn, back when she was a young woman with dreams larger than her reality. She had been in love once, truly in love, with a man who promised the world and gave only silence. A man whose admiration vanished the moment he realized that society, and his family, valued her dark skin less than her intelligence, less than her loyalty, less than her heart. When he left, Evelyn learned a painful truth. People could abandon you for reasons they never fully explained. They could reject you for something as simple and as cruel as the color of your skin. She never told anyone, not her parents, who already seemed burdened by her existence, not her sisters, who navigated their own privileges of lighter skin with ease, not her friends, who didn't know how deep the hurt could go. Instead, she buried the memory and built a life on resilience. She married later, raised her children, and became the grandmother who smiled quietly while the world overlooked her. But the secret lingered, shaping the way she saw herself. She learned to love without expectation, to give without receiving, and to exist without validation. And though no one knew, that secret of love lost, of worth questioned, of beauty unrecognized, was the quiet engine of her strength. Every small act of kindness she performed, every story she shared, every meal she prepared, it was all colored by that secret. It made her tender, fiercely protective, and unyieldingly patient, but it also made her wary, cautious, always observing how the world treated her. Evelyn carried this secret into her grandchildren's lives, too, in ways they could not understand. She taught lessons through silence, guidance through actions, and love through patience. Yet she never revealed the pain that had shaped her, for fear that it would be dismissed, or worse, used to justify the neglect she had endured. One night, as the house slept and the wind whispered against the windows, Evelyn took out her notebook. Her pen hovered over the page. For the first time, she considered writing the secret, not just her observations of the world, but the truth of her own heart. I have loved deeply, I have been hurt deeply, and yet I survive. She paused, tears blurred her vision, but she pressed on. I am not invisible, I have always been here. And one day they will understand, though it may be too late. Evelyn's secret was not meant to punish anyone. It was a testament, a record of a life lived quietly, fully and painfully. A secret that would one day demand recognition, not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. And with that realization, she felt a spark of power. For decades, the world had tried to erase her. But her truth, her secret, was hers alone, and no one could take that away. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. Evelyn didn't announce she was withdrawing from the world. She simply stopped showing up. The next Sunday brunch, she stayed in her room. The family noticed only when the plates on the table were left untouched. The first few times, they assumed she was tired. The second time, they whispered behind closed doors. By the third Sunday, a subtle panic had begun to settle. "Where is Mom?" her son asked, glancing around the empty chair. His voice carried a twinge of worry that hadn't existed when she was quietly present, but ignored. Her absence was now unavoidable. For decades, Evelyn had been invisible, standing in the background, smiling quietly, laboring without recognition. She had endured exclusion with patience, had worn silence like a cloak, had allowed love to flow unobserved. But when she disappeared, the world could no longer ignore her. Phone calls were made, texts were sent. Her daughter-in-law arrived at her door, feigning casual concern. "She's probably just resting," they said, though their eyes betrayed unease. Evelyn stayed in her room, listening to the footsteps pacing the hallways. She heard whispers through the thin walls. "She's gone, and we didn't even notice. How long has it been since she ate lunch? Did she say anything?" The family began to remember the meals she had prepared, the stories she had told, the hands that had wiped tears, healed scrapes, and guided the next generation. And with each recollection, guilt gnawed at their hearts. They realized, too late, that she had always been the quiet center of the family's existence. Without her, there was a hollow space that no decoration, no laughter, no photograph could fill. Evelyn watched them from her window. She had no desire to confront, to punish, or to lecture. She simply observed. The absence she had always endured, the absence imposed upon her by the family, by society, was now reversed. She was present in their minds, not in body, and it struck them harder than any words could. A small voice from the kitchen called her name, timid and guilty. Grandma. She smiled softly, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the quiet authority of someone who had carried decades of invisible labor and unconditional love. Yes, she said simply. And for the first time, they truly saw her, not the shadow in the corner, not the dark-skinned woman they had ignored, not the grandmother who had never been photographed in the frame, but Evelyn herself, strong, resilient, and unbreakable. The lesson was cruel, yet perfect. The world had only noticed her worth when it was in danger of losing it. She didn't gloat, she didn't scold. She merely returned to the family circle on her own terms, carrying with her the power of absence and the weight of recognition finally earned. Her notebook rested on the bedside table, pages filled with decades of love, pain, and truth. And now, with the world forced to acknowledge her, those pages were not just a record, they were a testament. I am here, I always have been. And now, you cannot ignore me. Weeks after Evelyn's quiet assertion of presence, her notebook had grown heavy with words, but her family still struggled to grasp the depth of what they had lost by ignoring her for so long. It was her eldest grandson who found the letter, tucked in the pages of an old cookbook she had used for decades, its edges frayed, smells of spices lingering in every corner. He had been searching for a recipe to impress his mother when he stumbled upon it. At first, he thought it was just another grocery list or a routine note. But as he unfolded the paper, the weight of decades hit him in an instant. To my family, it began, in handwriting strong yet trembling. I have lived my life loving you all without condition. I have cooked, cleaned, taught, listened, and guided you without ever asking for recognition. I have endured your laughter that ignored me, your conversations that went around me, your photos that erased me, and I did it silently so you would be comfortable. His hands shook as he read the lines, describing every unspoken slight, every moment she had been pushed aside, every gentle act of love no one noticed. Each sentence cut like a knife. I do not write this to accuse or shame. The letter continued, but to ensure that someday you will understand what it means to overlook someone who loves you without condition. I am not angry, I am tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of being tolerated, tired of living in a world that values shade over heart. You may have seen me as less, but I have always been everything I could be, for you. The room was silent as he read the final lines. If you ever truly want to know me, you will find my story in these words. It will be too late to undo the past, but perhaps it will help you honor the future. I am Evelyn, and I have always been here. The boy's eyes filled with tears. He had never noticed the weight of his grandmother's presence. He had never realized the sacrifices, the love, and the invisible labor that had shaped his life. The pain in those words was palpable. He ran to the living room, clutching the letter. Mom, Dad, you need to read this. But the damage was done. The letter revealed what they had overlooked for decades. Her love, her struggles, her resilience. They had been blind to it all. And now confronted with the truth, the family could no longer ignore the depth of what they had taken for granted. Evelyn herself entered the room, calm, composed, and still unshaken. She looked at them with the quiet authority of someone who had endured, survived, and loved through every injustice. The words of the letter hung in the air. Unspoken apologies, tears, and guilt filled the room. It was too late to change the past, but for the first time they saw her, truly saw her. Evelyn nodded silently, letting the moment speak for itself. Her love, her sacrifice, her presence had finally been recognized, even if through the piercing sorrow of too late. And in that moment, she realized something profound. Recognition may arrive late, but truth. The letter had been read. The room was silent, but not just ordinary silence. The kind of silence that presses into your chest and refuses to let you breathe. Every family member felt the weight of decades compressing in a single moment. Her words were not accusations. They were truth, painful, undeniable truth. Her daughter covered her mouth with trembling hands. I had no idea, she whispered, voice breaking. Her son sank into a chair, head in his hands. Mom, all this time, But Evelyn raised a hand, stopping them. She did not need apologies. She needed acknowledgement. Recognition, not for her benefit, but so that the cycle could end. For years, they had celebrated holidays without her, laughed in photos without her, ignored her presence, dismissed her contributions, overlooked her love. They had smiled in rooms she had decorated, eaten the meals she had cooked, and never once fully seen the woman who had given everything. And now, through the raw honesty of her letter, the truth could no longer be denied. Her youngest grandson, eyes wide, filled with guilt and awe, spoke first. "Grandma, I didn't know. I never saw. I'm sorry." Evelyn's eyes softened, but her voice remained calm and firm. "You are learning now. That is what matters. The rest is history." Her children, the adults who had lived comfortably ignoring her, began to grasp the depth of what they had done, how exclusion had been subtle, insidious and normalized, the quiet dismissals, the behind-the-back jokes, the way she had always been pushed aside. These were not accidents. They were conditioned behavior. Every story she had written, every detail she had preserved in her notebook, every unspoken moment of love and labor, it all painted a picture far bigger than any family photo or holiday gathering. It shook them, not just with guilt, but with revelation. They realized that for decades, they had been blind to the emotional and psychological weight carried by someone who was darker-skinned, quieter, and endlessly patient. They realized how much they had benefited from her labor while denying her presence. They realized that love without acknowledgement can become invisible, no matter how real it is. Evelyn, standing at the center of the room, was calm, strong, unshakable. Her voice carried a quiet authority. "I have loved all of you without condition," she said, "and I will continue to do so. But understand this. Love given freely should never be taken for granted. My absence should remind you that my presence has always mattered." Her family stared at her. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Some could barely speak. All understood. In that moment, the enormity of what they had ignored. For the first time, the grandmother they had pushed to the margins became the axis of their family. Not because she demanded it, but because truth, when finally revealed, cannot be denied. Her story had shattered old habits, opened long-closed eyes, and created a reverberation that would last for generations. The silence that had once hidden her was gone. She was seen, fully, painfully, and most importantly, indelibly. Evelyn didn't smile loudly. She didn't demand hugs or praises. She simply allowed herself to be witnessed, and that was enough. The room remained heavy with emotion, but it was no longer crushing. It was alive with recognition, understanding, and the quiet beginning of change. For the first time in decades, Evelyn felt a profound peace. Her love had always been enough, but now, finally, her family could see it. Evelyn's life, once quiet and invisible, now resonated in every corner of her family's home. The letter, the notebook, and the decades of unacknowledged love became a legacy more powerful than any photograph or trophy could ever be. Her grandchildren, now older and wiser, read her words and listened to her stories with new reverence. They remembered the meals she had made, the scraped knees she had kissed, the late nights she had stayed awake just to comfort them. Her lessons, once subtle, now rang loudly in their hearts. Love freely, act with compassion, and see people fully, not just the parts the world celebrates. Her family learned from her mistakes and triumphs. They realized that color, status, and appearances were never true measures of worth. Evelyn had endured decades of exclusion, yet she taught them that dignity and strength were defined not by recognition, but by the love and kindness one gives despite it all. The house, once a place of subtle cruelty and silent erasure, transformed. Photographs began to include her prominently, smiling naturally, standing at the center, no longer cropped out or pushed aside. Conversations turned to her stories, not around them, and at every holiday. She was not merely present, she was honored. Evelyn herself remained quiet, as she always had, but now her quietness was a statement of power. The woman who had been invisible in life had become immortal in memory, respect, and the hearts she had touched. She also left a physical legacy. The notebooks filled with her reflections, letters and lessons. Her grandchildren kept them, not as relics of pain, but as a roadmap of resilience. They promised to share her stories, to speak her truths, and to ensure that future generations understood the value of seeing everyone fully. Evelyn's final lesson was simple but eternal. Love without condition, give without expectation, and always remember that the quietest voices carry the deepest truths. Her family finally understood that her strength was never loud or demanding. It was patient, unwavering, and profound. It lived in their memories, their actions, and the very fabric of the home she had built, not just with her hands, but with her heart. In the end, Evelyn's life proved something extraordinary. Even when the world ignores you, Your love, your truth, and your existence can echo across generations, shaping hearts and minds long after your presence is fully acknowledged. She had been invisible for too long, but her legacy ensured that she would never, ever be forgotten. And in that realization, Evelyn found the peace she had sought for decades.